stop scrolling for 1 second. Right now, tonight, there are people in St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana, who are still pumping water out of their garages from yesterday afternoon. There are people in Galveston and Corpus Christi who are looking at the Gulf and seeing something that doesn't look right. A flat, oily swell rolling in under a sky that's basically clear. And there are people from Pensacola to Houston who are about to walk outside tomorrow morning into a heat index that is going to hit triple digits before lunch. 3 separate hazards, one storm system tying them all together. And I need you to actually pay attention for the next few minutes, because this is one of those setups where every single person along the Gulf Coast has a different threat coming at them at the same time. And if you only watch the headlines, you're going to miss the one that actually applies to you. Tropical Storm Bertha made landfall yesterday afternoon in St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana, at 2 p.m. Central Time. That's already happened. That's not the story anymore. The story is what Bertha is doing right now, tonight, and over the next 48 to 72 hours, because this storm is not done. It's not going to spin up into some monster hurricane. I'm going to tell you right now, it's not. But weak, sloppy, disorganized tropical systems like this one are exactly the kind of storm that kills people in ways that have nothing to do with wind speed, flooding, surf, and the heat that builds in right behind it. Let's break down all 3, day by day, so you know exactly what's coming to your part of the coast and when. Let's get everybody on the same page, because Bertha has already had a strange life for a tropical storm. This is the second named storm of the 2026 Atlantic hurricane season, and if you've been paying attention to the season so far, you know it's been quiet. We're dealing with a fairly strong El Niño pattern this year, and that tends to crank up upper-level wind shear across the Atlantic and Caribbean, which is bad news for anything trying to organize into a hurricane. Bertha has been fighting that shear pretty much since the day she formed. This storm has never had a symmetric, well-organized core. Forecasters have been calling it lopsided all week, and that's the right word. Almost all of Bertha's heaviest rain and strongest wind has been sitting well south and east of the actual center, offshore over open water, while the center itself tracked along the coast looking almost unimpressive on satellite. Don't let unimpressive on satellite fool you. That is not the same thing as not dangerous. I'll explain why in a minute. Bertha came ashore yesterday in St. Bernard Parish with maximum sustained winds of 45 miles per hour. Before landfall, tropical storm warnings stretched from the Florida Panhandle, Panama City, Pensacola, all the way through Mobile, Gulfport, and into southeastern Louisiana, with a specific tropical storm warning in effect for New Orleans. Louisiana's governor had already pre-staged about 30,000 sandbags across Orleans Parish, and more than 90% of the city's major drainage pumps were confirmed operational going into the storm. That's the kind of preparation that actually matters for a system like this, because New Orleans' entire relationship with rainfall is about whether those pumps can keep up, not about wind. After landfall, Bertha weakened, moved back offshore into the Gulf, and is now on a track that's going to bring it near or along the Louisiana and upper Texas coasts through today, with a second landfall expected along the northwestern Gulf Coast. Think somewhere around the upper Texas coast, later today or tonight. From there, the National Hurricane Center's forecast has it weakening back to a tropical depression by tomorrow, and either dissipating or transitioning into a plain old post-tropical rainstorm by the end of the week as it pushes inland over Texas. So here's the headline most people are going to take away from that. Storm's basically over, it's just a depression now. And on wind alone, sure. But I want you to think about this storm less like a hurricane and more like a fire hose that somebody left lying on the ground, sweeping back and forth. The wind was never really the point with Bertha. The water always was. This is the part where I want to slow down and actually explain the atmospheric mechanics, because understanding why Bertha is a flood threat instead of a wind threat changes how seriously you take it. When a tropical system is tight and well organized, a nice symmetric hurricane with a clear eye, its heaviest rain tends to be concentrated close to the center and moves through relatively fast. You get a bad few hours and then it's gone. Bertha is the opposite of that, because wind shear has been tearing at the storm since it formed. The center and the deep convection, the thunderstorm engine, have been separated. That means instead of one tight ring of intense rain, you get broad, sprawling bands of tropical moisture that can sit and grind over the same areas for hour after hour. Meteorologists call this training, like train cars on a track. Storm cell after storm cell, rolling over the exact same neighborhoods instead of spreading the rain out. And Bertha has fuel to do that. Gulf water temperatures right now are running near record warm for this time of year. Warm water means more evaporation, more moisture getting pulled up into the storm, and higher precipitable water values. That's the technical term, PWAT, for how much liquid water is packed into the entire depth of the atmosphere above a given spot. High PWAT air masses are basically atmospheric sponges. When you wring them out over one location instead of spreading them across a region, you get flash flooding, even from a storm with weak, unimpressive winds. That's exactly what's happening along the Texas Gulf Coast today. The National Weather Service is forecasting total rainfall amounts of 2 to 4 inches through tonight along the Texas coast and into South Texas, with isolated pockets that could see up to 6 inches. In a rural area with good drainage, 2 to 4 inches over a day is a nuisance. In an urban area with a lot of pavement and storm drains that are already stressed, think Houston, think Corpus Christi, that same rainfall total, especially if it comes in a concentrated burst instead of spread evenly, is enough to put water over roads and into low-lying homes within an hour or two. The Weather Service has specifically flagged that this rain may produce isolated flash flooding, especially in urban areas. That phrase, isolated flash flooding, is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and I don't want you to read past it. Isolated doesn't mean unlikely. It means it's not going to flood everywhere, but wherever it does happen, it's going to happen fast, and it's probably going to happen where a lot of people live. Meanwhile, and this is the part almost nobody's talking about, Bertha's moisture isn't staying in the Gulf. There's a stalled cold front sitting over the southeast right now, and that front is acting like a magnet, pulling tropical moisture out of the Gulf and dragging it up into southeast Virginia, the Carolinas, and northern Georgia. That combination, deep tropical moisture plus a boundary that isn't moving, is a textbook recipe for a much more serious flooding rain event, hundreds of miles away from where Bertha's actual center is tracking. So if you've got family in the Carolinas or Virginia, this isn't just a Gulf Coast story. Bertha is basically acting as a moisture pipeline into a completely separate severe weather setup on the East Coast. And that setup could end up producing more total rainfall and more flood damage than anything happening at the coast itself. I want to be really clear about something here because I don't want to be sensationalist about this storm. Bertha is not a hurricane. It's not going to have hurricane-force winds. Structures along the coast are not facing a wind-driven disaster. But flooding doesn't care about the category on the storm. Flash flooding is one of the top weather killers in this country every single year, and it kills people in cars far more often than it kills people in houses. If you take one thing from this section, take this. Do not drive into standing water, even water that looks shallow, even water you think you recognize from a road you drive every day. Turn around, don't drown is a cliche at this point, because it's true, and it is going to be relevant somewhere along the Gulf Coast in the southeast over the next 48 hours. Now, let's talk about the second hazard, because I think this one is genuinely underrated by people who aren't watching the coast closely. Surf and rip currents. Even with Bertha weakening, a high surf warning has been in effect along parts of the northern Gulf Coast, alongside rip current statements and coastal flood advisories stretching from the Florida panhandle through Alabama. Here's the mechanism. In plain language, a tropical system doesn't need to be strong or even close to shore to generate dangerous surf. Wind fields on tropical systems, even lopsided, disorganized ones like Bertha, extend way out from the center, sometimes hundreds of miles. That wind, blowing over open water for a long distance, generates swell. That swell radiates outward from the storm regardless of exactly where the center makes landfall, and it arrives at the beach as long-period waves that look almost gentle from the shore, but are moving a tremendous amount of water. Here's why that's actually more dangerous than obvious storm-driven chop. When the surface looks calmish, but there's a strong groundswell underneath, casual beachgoers have no visual cue to stay out of the water. Nobody thinks twice about wading in on a partly sunny day with 3-foot waves. But that swell energy interacting with sandbars and breaks in the shoreline creates rip currents, narrow, fast-moving channels of water flowing back out to sea, and those currents can run at several miles per hour, far faster than almost anyone can swim against. The National Weather Service office covering the Mobile and Pensacola area has been blunt about this all week, flagging rip currents as the #1 weather-related killer along Gulf Coast beaches. Full stop, not just during storms. This week, with Bertha's swell still working through the Gulf, even as the storm itself weakens and moves toward Texas, that risk is elevated everywhere from the Panhandle through coastal Alabama, and honestly, it's a smart idea to assume that risk extends along essentially the entire northern Gulf shoreline through the rest of this week. If you're at the beach and you see red flags, that's not a suggestion, that's a warning that's been issued for a reason. If you get caught in a rip current, don't fight it directly back to shore. Swim parallel to the beach until you're out of the current, then angle back in. Panicking and swimming straight against it is how strong swimmers drown. So here's the accountability piece for this section. If you or your family have any beach plans in the next few days anywhere from the Florida Panhandle to the Texas coast, I need you to actually check the local surf and rip current forecast before you go, not just the general weather forecast. A sunny day with light wind can still be an incredibly dangerous day to swim right now, and that disconnect between what the sky looks like and what the water's doing is exactly what catches people off guard. Okay, now for the third piece of this, and honestly, over the next week, I think this ends up being the hazard that affects the most total people, even though it gets the least dramatic coverage. As Bertha weakens and pushes inland over Texas today and tonight, it's going to leave behind exactly the atmospheric setup that builds dangerous heat: a clearing sky, subsiding air, and a ridge of high pressure that's already been building across the Gulf Coast and is now forecast to expand into the southern plains and the desert southwest through the end of this week. Let me explain why a storm moving out actually makes the heat worse, because this trips people up. When a tropical system, or its remnants, move through and then depart, they often leave the atmosphere primed for a strong ridge of high pressure to build in right behind them. That ridge brings sinking air, and sinking air compresses and warms as it descends. That's just basic thermodynamics. It's the same reason air heats up as you pump it into a tire. Sinking air also suppresses cloud formation, so you get clear skies, unobstructed sunshine, and on top of all that, the ground and the Gulf itself are still saturated with moisture from the storm that just passed through. That combination, intense sun, saturated ground, and high humidity left over from Bertha, is the exact recipe for oppressive, dangerous heat index values, because humidity is what turns a hot day into a genuinely hazardous one. Your body cools itself by sweating and having that sweat evaporate. When the air is already saturated with moisture, sweat can't evaporate efficiently, and your body's cooling system basically stalls out, even if the actual air temperature isn't record-breaking. That's exactly what's forecast here. Along the immediate Gulf Coast today, actual air temperatures are only running in the lower 90s in a lot of spots, which doesn't sound extreme by itself. But heat index values, what it actually feels like on your body, are forecast up to 110 degrees in coastal zones from the Florida Big Bend through the central Gulf. That's not a feels warm number. That's a number where heat exhaustion and heat stroke become real risks for anyone spending extended time outside, especially kids, elderly folks, outdoor workers, and anyone without reliable air conditioning. And this isn't just a one-day spike. The heat is forecast to expand and intensify inland behind Bertha, spreading from the Gulf Coast into the southern plains and desert southwest through the end of this week, with extreme heat warnings already posted well inland as this ridge builds and strengthens. So the pattern here is genuinely the storm moves through. The flood threat and the surf threat peak in the next 24 to 48 hours along the coast. And then the heat threat takes over and spreads inland, lasting longer and covering a much larger footprint than the storm itself ever did. If there's a preparedness action item in this whole script that I want every single person watching to actually do, it's this. Check on elderly neighbors and relatives this week, especially anyone who might not run their air conditioning because of cost, and especially in areas that just went through power outages or storm damage from Bertha's passage. Heat is a quiet killer. It doesn't make headlines the way a hurricane does, but heat kills more people in an average year in this country than almost any other weather hazard combined. And a lot of those deaths are preventable with something as simple as a phone call and a ride to somewhere with air conditioning. Let me lay this out clearly so you have a mental map of exactly what's happening and when, because I know I just threw 3 different hazards at you, and I want to make sure it's organized in your head before you close this out. Today, Thursday, July 23rd. Bertha, now down to winds around 45 miles per hour and weakening, is tracking along or near the Louisiana and upper Texas coasts, with a second landfall expected along the northwestern Gulf Coast later today or tonight. Rainfall totals of 2 to 4 inches, isolated 6 inches, are expected along the Texas coast and into South Texas through tonight, with the specific risk of isolated flash flooding in urban areas like Houston and Corpus Christi. At the same time, high surf warnings, rip current statements, and coastal flood advisories remain active from the Florida Panhandle through coastal Alabama, driven by swell that's continuing to radiate out from the storm regardless of exactly where the center is. And along the immediate coast, heat index values are running up to 110 in spots even today, with air temperatures in the lower 90s but oppressive humidity making it feel far worse. Tonight into tomorrow, Friday, July 24th, Bertha is forecast to weaken back to a tropical depression as it pushes inland over Texas. The wind threat essentially ends here, but the rain that's already fallen doesn't just disappear. Saturated ground means any additional rainfall, even from ordinary afternoon thunderstorms unrelated to Bertha directly, can run off much faster than normal and create secondary flooding concerns in the same areas that just got hit. Meanwhile, far to the east, Bertha's moisture is still feeding that stalled front over the southeast. And the flooding rain threat across southeast Virginia, the Carolinas, and northern Georgia is expected to continue building through Thursday and likely into Friday as well. Through the end of this week, Bertha itself is forecast to dissipate or transition into a plain post-tropical rain system over Texas. But behind it, the ridge of high pressure that's been building takes over completely. Dangerous heat expands from the Gulf Coast into the southern plains and desert southwest, with extreme heat warnings already posted and expected to persist for days. This is the part of the story that lasts the longest and, frankly, is going to affect the most people across the broadest area, even though the tropical storm itself will be long gone by the time it peaks. That's the sequence. Wind mostly over already. Flood threat peaking today and into tomorrow, both directly along the coast and hundreds of miles away in the southeast. Surf and rip current danger persistent through the week even as the storm weakens. And heat, building in right behind all of it, expanding and intensifying as we move into next week. I want to zoom out for a second because I think it matters for how you think about the rest of this hurricane season. Bertha is only the second named storm of the 2026 season, and by most measures, it's been a slow start. Forecasts from the National Hurricane Center and Colorado State University both called for a below-average number of storms this year, largely because of that strong El Niño pattern I mentioned earlier, which tends to increase wind shear across the Atlantic Basin and make it harder for tropical systems to organize and intensify. That's why Bertha struggled to ever look like a real hurricane on satellite, and it's a big part of why forecasters don't expect it to strengthen beyond tropical storm status at any point in its life cycle. But here's the thing I want you to sit with. A weak, disorganized, shear-torn tropical storm still managed to trigger a high surf warning, a rip current statement, a coastal flood advisory, a specific tropical storm warning for a major metro area, the deployment of 30,000 sandbags, and a flash flood risk serious enough to be called out by name for urban areas hundreds of miles apart. And it's also acting as the fuse for a separate, arguably more dangerous flooding event on the entire East Coast. A slow season doesn't mean a safe season. It means the storms that do form aren't guaranteed to look scary on a satellite loop to get the job done. Gulf water is still running near record warm this year, and that warm water is fuel, full stop, regardless of what the wind shear is doing to the storm's structure. As long as that fuel is sitting there, any system that even gets close to organizing can produce a serious flood and surf threat, even if it never earns a hurricane designation. That's the pattern I want you watching for the rest of this season. Don't just ask, is this going to be a hurricane? Ask, how much moisture is this thing carrying, and where is it going to sit? That question tells you a lot more about who's actually at risk. So here's where I land on all of this, and here's what I actually want you to do. If you're anywhere along the Gulf Coast, from the Florida Panhandle through Texas, today and tomorrow are your window for the flood and surf threat. Know your evacuation routes if you're in a flood-prone area, especially anywhere that's dealt with urban flooding before. Houston, I'm looking at you specifically given what's forecast today. Do not drive through standing water. I don't care how well you know the road. If you've got beach plans anywhere along the northern Gulf this week, check the specific surf and rip current forecast for your beach before you go, not just the general weather app forecast. A calm-looking day can still carry a deadly current underneath it. And starting tomorrow and continuing into next week, shift your mindset from storm to heat. Check on elderly relatives and neighbors. Limit strenuous outdoor activity during peak afternoon hours. Stay hydrated, and don't wait until you feel bad to take a break. Heat illness sneaks up fast, especially in this kind of humid post-storm air mass. I'm going to be watching Bertha's remnants and this developing East Coast flood threat closely over the next 48 hours, along with how this ridge builds and expands the heat risk into next week, and I'll have an update for you as soon as there's something meaningful to report. Until then, take care of yourselves, take care of your neighbors, and I'll see you in the next one.